The Young and the Restless Spoilers. The story of Matt was supposed to have ended in Los Angeles, a city of illusions where people reinvent themselves every day, and where his crimes, betrayals, and obsessions had already left behind a trail of destruction that no one wished to revisit. Yet, like every shadow that refuses to fade under the brightest sun, Matt carried something deeper than revenge, a haunting question that refused to die. For years, he had played the villain in everyone else's story, the manipulator who ruined lives, seduced trust, and vanished before anyone could understand what truly drove him. But now, for the first time, his purpose was not rooted in destruction but in discovery. The clues that had followed him from one city to another, fragments of old hospital records, a faded photograph, a name whispered by a dying stranger, all pointed toward a single, chilling conclusion. The woman who had abandoned him decades ago was not a ghost, not a myth, but a living presence in Genoa City. That realization ignited something primitive in him, something far older than his schemes or his grudges. The idea that his entire life, every cruel act and desperate lie, had been shaped by an origin he had never known filled him with an urgency that no law or moral could contain. He had to find her. And if the universe dared to hide her from him again, he would burn through every truth and every lie that stood in his way. When Matt arrived in Genoa City, he was not the same man who had left Los Angeles behind. The city's cold air felt cleaner, crueler, as if it had been waiting for him. Every street corner seemed to whisper names, and every familiar face seemed to conceal recognition. He began quietly, haunting the archives of Memorial Hospital, bribing clerks for access to birth certificates, adoption records, anything that might lead him closer to the woman he could not name. It was ironic, for years, people had tried to uncover Matt's secrets, but now it was Matt who was tearing through layers of the past like a surgeon cutting into his own wound. In the silence of dusty records, a pattern began to emerge. A boy born in secrecy, his birth sealed by a private doctor whose license had long been revoked, his mother listed only by an alias. The signature on one of those documents was smudged, but one letter, the letter N, struck him like thunder. He did not dare to hope, yet his instincts, sharpened by years of deception, told him that this was no coincidence. Every instinct in his body screamed that the path led to one woman. Nikki, the matriarch of the Newman Empire, the figure who embodied both power and scandal, the woman who had lived more lives than anyone in Genoa could count. If it was true, if she was truly the woman who had given him life and abandoned him to darkness, then Genoa City was standing on the edge of an explosion it could never contain. The idea seemed absurd even to him at first. Nikki was untouchable, the kind of woman who had survived addiction, marriages, betrayals, and death itself. But the more he studied her, every photograph, every charity event, every newspaper clipping, the more the resemblance began to mock him. The tilt of her head, the defiance in her eyes, the way she masked her vulnerability with elegance, it was all too familiar. Matt began to see her not as a symbol of society's glamour but as a mirror of his own fractured identity. And perhaps that was what terrified him most. Could it be that the darkness that had followed him all his life was inherited, not chosen? Could it be that his thirst for control, for domination, was born from a woman who had spent her youth trying to escape her own demons? The possibility gnawed at him. It wasn't just a personal mystery anymore, it was a war between bloodlines, between what is inherited and what is made. Genoa City had witnessed countless scandals over the decades, affairs, murders, betrayals. But if Matt's suspicion was true, this would be something else entirely. It would not just rewrite history, it would fracture it. Behind the polished doors of the Newman estate, the tension was already palpable. Nikki had sensed a strange unease long before Matt arrived. She had been haunted by anonymous letters, photographs left on her doorstep, and fragments of lullabies she hadn't heard in 50 years. She dismissed them at first, thinking they were the cruel tricks of her enemies or the delusions of a mind worn down by too many ghosts. Yet something inside her, an old maternal ache she thought had died, began to stir again. Memories long buried began to resurface, a night in a small clinic outside the city, a child's cry, the sound of footsteps retreating down a corridor. She had told herself that child never survived. But the mind has a way of rewriting trauma into convenient lies, and now the past was knocking on her door, wearing the face of a man everyone in Genoa feared. As Matt moved deeper into Genoa's social labyrinth, he realized how tightly the city guarded its secrets. Every person he met seemed to be connected to Nikki in some way, and yet none dared to speak her name in the same breath as his. Victor's empire loomed like a shadow over everything, and Matt understood that confronting Nikki would also mean provoking Victor, the man who had built a dynasty on control and intimidation. But Matt had nothing left to lose. His life was already a graveyard of ruined connections. The irony was bitter. For years, people had accused him of being heartless, and now he was about to confront the one person whose existence could prove that he did, in fact, have a heart. One she had left to freeze decades ago. He began to leave traces, small but deliberate, to draw her attention: a newspaper clipping about a missing child, a donation made in her name to a forgotten orphanage, a photograph of a young boy placed on the steps of her foundation. Each act was both a message and a wound, forcing her closer to the truth she had avoided all her life. In private moments, Matt wrestled with what he would do once he found her. Part of him wanted to destroy her, to expose her hypocrisy and watch her kingdom crumble under the weight of her guilt. Another part, smaller but more dangerous, longed for recognition, a word, a glance, something that would tell him his existence had meant something to someone. That duality tormented him more than any prison cell ever could. He saw her everywhere now, in the shimmer of a wine glass at the club, in the soft laughter of women who admired her strength. The more he tried to hate her, the more the void inside him grew. It was no longer about revenge or revelation, it was about identity. Who was Matt Clark if not the echo of a lie told decades ago? And what would he become if that lie was shattered? Meanwhile, Genoa City began to feel the ripples of his presence. Strange incidents occurred, security footage erased, old records missing, phone lines tapped. It was as though the city itself was rewriting its memory to make room for the truth. Nikki, unaware of how close he was, began to lose sleep, haunted by faces she could no longer place. Even Victor noticed the change in her, the quiet fear beneath her composure, the way her hand trembled when she held a glass of wine. But Victor, in his arrogance, dismissed it as weakness, never suspecting that the real threat was not a corporate rival or a political scandal but a ghost from Nikki's own bloodline. When Matt finally stood outside the gates of the Newman estate one cold evening, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't there for money, revenge, or fame. He was there for the truth that had been denied him since birth, the truth that might destroy them both. If Nikki was indeed his mother, then Genoa City was about to face its greatest reckoning. The woman who had built her legacy on survival would now have to confront the one sin she could never erase. And Matt, for all his cruelty and madness, would finally understand what had driven him all these years, the endless hunger to belong. In that twisted symmetry they were alike, both survivors, both manipulators, both slaves to the lies that kept them alive. Whether their reunion would end in forgiveness or fire was a question no one could answer. But one thing was certain: Genoa City would never be the same again. For when blood and betrayal meet under the same roof, history doesn't just repeat itself, it devours everything in its path. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening at the Newman estate, the kind of quiet dusk that fell over Genoa City with a deceptive calm. But for Nikki, peace had never lasted long. Her life was built upon carefully arranged fragments of the past, some shining, others jagged, all held together by the illusion that she had already faced the worst of her sins. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the man standing before her now, the stranger who carried the weight of every buried memory she had tried to forget. The moment her eyes met Matt's, time seemed to bend inward, collapsing years into seconds. There was no mistaking the truth her soul recognized before her mind could accept it. The face that had haunted her dreams, the void that had followed her for decades, it was standing there, breathing, broken, and alive. She didn't need a DNA test, a record, or a confession. She knew. The child she had once held for only minutes before being told he would never survive had returned to her as a man shaped by rage and abandonment. Her son was alive, and he had come to find her. For a long time, Nikki couldn't move. Every nerve in her body screamed between disbelief and longing. Matt's voice trembled as he spoke, not with anger but with exhaustion, the tone of someone who had spent a lifetime searching through lies and half-truths only to arrive at the cruelest one of all. He had come to Genoa seeking justice, but standing before the woman who had given him life, the rage inside him began to unravel. He saw not the cold socialite he had imagined, but a woman whose beauty couldn't mask the deep, familiar ache behind her eyes. She reached out instinctively, her hands trembling as she touched his face, as if afraid he might vanish if she blinked. The warmth of his skin, the quiet resistance in his stance, it was all real. And as tears welled in her eyes, decades of denial shattered in an instant. She pulled him into her arms, whispering his name, a name she hadn't dared to say out loud in years. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was instinct. The kind only a mother could feel for the child she had lost. But the embrace that should have been salvation carried within it the seed of devastation. Nikki knew the cost of the truth she was holding. Genoa City was not a place that forgave easily, and the Newman family least of all. If Victor ever learned that Matt was her son, not his, not their family's, but the child of a rival whose name she had buried with shame, the empire he built would fracture beyond repair. Victor had always believed that loyalty was the cornerstone of love. For Nikki to reveal that she had once belonged to another man, that she had carried his child and concealed it, would not just wound him, it would destroy the myth of invincibility that surrounded him. And Nikki, standing there with her son in her arms, understood that the love she had yearned for all her life was also the weapon that could undo her entire world. Matt could feel her trembling, and even without words, he understood. He had not only found his mother, he had stumbled into a secret powerful enough to tear down dynasties. In the days that followed, Nikki's life became a haunting blur of fear and awakening. Every moment spent with Matt was a battle between joy and guilt. She wanted to know everything, the orphanages, the foster homes, the betrayals that had hardened him into the man he had become. Yet every story he told made her hate herself a little more. The child she had been told had died had instead been sent away, quietly hidden by those who believed they were protecting her reputation. The truth was cruel in its simplicity. While she was rebuilding her life with Victor, her son had been living a nightmare she could have stopped if only she had known. The irony cut deeper than any betrayal she had endured. She had spent years rescuing others? Her children, her husband, even her enemies, yet she had never saved the one who mattered most. And now, fate had brought him back not as a boy seeking love, but as a man who carried the scars of every lie told in her name. Matt, too, was unraveling. The vengeance that had fueled him for years was dissolving in the face of a truth he didn't know how to live with. He wanted to hate her, to accuse her of abandonment, but every time he looked into her eyes, the anger faltered. The maternal tenderness he had been denied was suddenly suffocating him. For the first time, he didn't know who to be, the villain, the son, or the lost child who just wanted to belong. The cruelest part was knowing that the world he had entered was built on the very deception that had defined his life. He saw Victor's name everywhere, in headlines, in buildings, in the reverence people showed him. And beneath that power, he saw the man who had unknowingly raised his half-siblings, who had lived a life Matt could never have. The thought consumed him. He wasn't just the outsider, he was the flaw in the Newman legacy, the living proof that perfection had always been an illusion. Nikki tried to protect him as best she could. She arranged secret meetings, dinners at secluded places, moments stolen in the shadows of her own mansion. She told herself she needed time. Time to prepare Victor, to craft a version of the truth he could survive. But time, as always in Genoa City, was running out. Whispers began to circulate. People noticed the mysterious man who seemed to appear wherever Nikki went, the tension in her smile, the fear behind her eyes. And Victor, whose instincts had been sharpened by decades of betrayal, began to sense the shift. He watched her more closely, questioning the late-night phone calls, the secretive drives, the way she seemed to carry both joy and dread in equal measure. It wasn't jealousy at first, it was control. Victor didn't lose control. But when he finally uncovered the name Matt Clark, something inside him snapped. He knew the name, knew the chaos it had once brought to Los Angeles, and the fact that this man had come to Genoa meant trouble. What he didn't know, what Nikki couldn't yet bring herself to tell him, was that the trouble had her blood in its veins. The day of reckoning came without warning. Victor walked into Nikki's private suite and found her with Matt. The room froze. There were no explanations that could soften the sight of his wife holding another man's hand with tears in her eyes. The silence between them was more violent than any outburst. Victor demanded the truth, and when Nikki finally gave it. When she whispered that Matt was her son, the world tilted off its axis. Victor's fury was not loud. It was cold, deliberate, surgical. He felt betrayed not by her body but by her history, by the realization that there was a part of her life he had never truly owned. To learn that her son was the child of his old rival, a man he had once sworn to destroy, was an irony so bitter it was almost poetic. Matt stood motionless, watching the empire his mother had built begin to crumble before his eyes. For years, he had dreamed of revenge, and now that it was within reach, it felt hollow. The destruction he had imagined brought him no peace. He saw in Victor's eyes the reflection of the man he could have become, ruthless, unyielding, and alone. Nikki's tears did nothing to bridge the chasm that opened that night. Victor retreated into silence, his pride warring with the remnants of love. Nikki, for the first time in decades, found herself powerless. She had always believed she could manage any crisis, a scandal, an affair, even a death, with grace and composure. But this was different. This was her soul being judged by the man she loved, and by the son she had lost. Genoa City would soon learn the truth, and when it did, the fallout would be catastrophic. The media would feast on the revelation, competitors would exploit the weakness, and the Newman legacy would tremble. Yet amid the chaos, something miraculous began to take root, the possibility of healing. Matt, who had arrived seeking vengeance, began to see that the real battle wasn't with Victor or even with Nikki. It was with himself, with the years he had allowed anger to define him. In the end, he was still that boy in the orphanage, waiting for someone to tell him he mattered. As weeks passed, the house that once symbolized power became a place of reckoning. Nikki spent her nights wandering the halls, replaying every choice that had led her here. Victor watched her from afar, torn between rage and the unbearable truth that he still loved her. Matt, caught between two worlds, began to realize that being a Newman, by blood or not, came with a curse as much as a crown. He had wanted to destroy this family, yet now he was part of it, bound by a secret that none of them could escape. The past could not be undone, but it could be faced. And in the end, that was all any of them could do. For the first time in her life, Nikki was not running from her past but embracing it, no matter how much it burned. The woman who had once built an empire of appearances was finally stripped bare, left only with the truth, and the hope that somehow, love could survive it. But in Genoa City, peace is always temporary. Victor's silence was not forgiveness, it was strategy. Matt's presence had awakened old rivalries, and enemies who once feared Victor now saw an opening. The revelation of Nikki's son was not just a personal scandal, it was a weapon. As whispers spread, the city began to fracture along familiar fault lines of loyalty and betrayal. And somewhere in the shadows, the man whose blood ran through Matt's veins, the rival who had once loved and lost Nikki, might still be alive, waiting for his own chance to return. Because in Genoa City, no secret stays buried forever, and every truth, no matter how painful, is only the beginning of another war.